Hi, I am Rahul. Welcome to HOA Case Lab, sharing real-style HOA drama, cases, and satisfying revenge moments. The craziest part about HOA stories is that they always start with somebody feeling untouchable every single time. Somebody gets a tiny bit of authority, a clipboard, maybe a gated entrance sign, and suddenly they start acting like they own an entire county. But this story, bro, this one genuinely blew my mind because the HOA didn't just harass one homeowner over grass height or mailbox colors. No, these people somehow built 37 entire homes on land they legally did not own. And the worst part, they thought they could bury the mistake forever because the actual owner lived quietly upstream and almost never came down to the development, and that confidence lasted right up until the day the floodgates opened, literally, and when the county investigators finally showed up afterward, what they found underneath those luxury homes was unbelievable. The story centered around a man named Daniel Mercer, a civil engineer in his late 50s who inherited several hundred acres of mountain land from his grandfather decades earlier. Most of the property sat untouched in a heavily forested valley, outside a rapidly growing town where suburban expansion had started swallowing farmland at an absurd pace. Daniel wasn't one of those ultra-wealthy land barons either. He lived modestly in an older cabin near the northern ridge and had mostly kept to himself while leasing portions of his land to logging crews and environmental research groups throughout the years. The property itself was difficult to access, and because county records were still partially digitized from old surveys, ownership lines in that area were notoriously confusing. Now that right there was the first domino. Because whenever lazy developers meet outdated county maps, disaster usually follows. About 8 years before everything collapsed, a luxury housing developer purchased neighboring land beside Daniels Valley. The company partnered with a newly formed HOA called Silver Ridge Estates, promising wealthy retirees, scenic mountain homes, private trails, artificial ponds, and gated privacy. Marketing brochures described the place like it was some elite wilderness paradise. The houses sold fast too, mostly to out-of-state buyers who wanted expensive vacation homes surrounded by nature. But behind the scenes, corners were getting cut everywhere. The developers relied on a Rust property survey performed by a contractor with multiple prior complaints against his license. Instead of physically verifying old boundary markers throughout the forest, the contractor allegedly copied parcel coordinates from decades-old county records and overlaid them onto updated satellite maps. That mistake shifted a massive section of the southern property line nearly 300 feet into Daniel's land, and nobody noticed. Or maybe some people did notice and simply stayed quiet because too much money was already flowing. That's exactly how people act in real life once millions of dollars get involved. Construction expanded aggressively over the next 4 years. Roads were paved, utility lines were buried, decorative fences appeared along hiking paths. Then came the homes themselves. Massive luxury properties with stone entrances, heated driveways, imported landscaping, and private decks overlooking Daniels Reservoir upstream. Families moved in believing everything had been legally approved. 3. Meanwhile, Daniel barely visited the Southern Valley anymore. His cabin sat miles away uphill, and most of his attention focused on maintaining an old hydroelectric water control system his grandfather built the decades earlier. The reservoir above the valley had originally supplied irrigation channels for old farming communities long before suburban expansion arrived. Over time, the farming system disappeared, but Daniel retained legal ownership of the water management structures because they remained tied to his inherited land rights, and that detail became unbelievably important later. For years, Daniel ignored the growing development below because he assumed the neighboring company stayed within its own boundaries. He occasionally noticed construction noise in the distance, but mountain terrain muffled most activity. Besides, he had no reason to suspect an entire HOA neighborhood was slowly invading his land parcel piece by piece. The first warning sign came from something incredibly stupid. One afternoon, Daniel drove down an old service road to inspect erosion barriers near the reservoir spillway after heavy rainfall. But halfway there, he discovered a locked metal gate blocking access. Not a temporary construction gate either. This thing had keypad entry, HOA warning signs, and a massive decorative stone wall reading Silver Ridge Private Access Only. On his road, Bro, the audacity already would have sent me into orbit. Daniel initially assumed it was some misunderstanding. He contacted the HOA management office calmly and explained that the road crossed his inherited property easement, but instead of apologizing, the HOA board president responded with absolute confidence that Silver Ridge Estates legally owned all infrastructure within the Southern Valley District. That conversation changed everything. For Daniel pulled old property archives from storage and hired a licensed surveyor to independently verify the boundaries. 2 weeks later, the survey results came back, and according to the updated measurements, not only did the HOA gate sit illegally on his property, but nearly 40% of the entire subdivision crossed into his land. 37 homes, entire roads, drainage systems, retaining walls, even parts of the HOA clubhouse. At that point, Daniel reportedly thought the survey company made a mistake because the scale of the encroachment sounded impossible. But after commissioning a second independent survey, the findings matched almost perfectly. The subdivision had expanded deep into his valley using incorrect coordinates from the original developer maps. Now here's where the story gets even crazier. Instead of immediately admitting fault, the HOA lawyer allegedly tried intimidating Daniel into selling the disputed land retroactively. They argued that homeowners purchased properties in good faith and claimed challenging ownership would destabilize the local housing market. Daniel received letters suggesting legal battles could drag for years while costing everyone enormous amounts of money, which basically translates to, please quietly surrender your land so we don't look incompetent. And apparently the HOA board became extremely arrogant during negotiations because they assumed Daniel lacked the resources to fight back against a wealthy subdivision full of retired executives and corporate attorneys. Residents began treating him like some bitter old mountain man obstructing community growth. Some homeowners even complained online that Daniel was trying to extort the neighborhood after homes were already built. And that part genuinely irritated me because people always mock property rights until somebody steals their land. 5 Daniel still attempted peaceful solutions at first. He proposed land leasing agreements, easement restructuring, and mediation through county officials. But the HOA board rejected nearly every compromise because they believed they could eventually pressure him into accepting a minimal settlement. Meanwhile, construction crews continued expanding landscaping deeper into his property despite active disputes. Then came the reservoir inspection. During legal preparation, Daniel hired environmental engineers to assess how unauthorized construction affected upstream drainage systems connected to his inherited water infrastructure. The findings were catastrophic. Developers had redirected natural runoff channels throughout the subdivision without properly updating floodplain calculations. Several retention ponds violated state environmental codes, and, worst of all, portions of the neighborhood sat directly within historical overflow zones connected to Daniel's emergency spillway network. In simple terms, the HOA built luxury homes inside an old controlled flood basin, and somehow nobody checked, and that revelation completely shifted Daniel's strategy. Instead of continuing endless negotiations, he quietly began restoring his grandfather's original water management permits with state authorities. Engineers inspected old floodgates, reinforced concrete channels, and verified operational control rights attached to the reservoir. Every document came back legally valid because the infrastructure predated modern subdivision laws by decades. Meanwhile, the HOA board kept escalating tensions without realizing what was happening upstream. They fined Daniel for unauthorized vehicle access across roads sitting on his own land. One board member reportedly threatened trespassing charges if he entered the gated community again. Hearing that honestly made my jaw drop because the sheer confidence was unbelievable. And then nature added pressure of its own. 6. An unusually wet spring caused reservoir levels to rise faster than expected. State inspectors warned Daniel that water volume approached mandatory discharge thresholds requiring partial floodgate releases to prevent structural overload. Normally overflow water spread harmlessly across undeveloped lowland sections of the valley, except those low ones weren't undeveloped anymore. They were now filled with million-dollar homes built by people who ignored decades-old flood records. And that was the exact moment Daniel realized the HOA had trapped itself in a disaster entirely of its own making. The county meetings started getting tense after that. Engineers debated liability. Lawyers scrambled through historical maps. Homeowners panicked as rumors spread about floodplain violations. Yet somehow the HOA board still insisted Daniel should keep the gates closed for the good of the community. But legally, he couldn't. And once the first major storm system appeared on the weather radar, everything started moving toward a collision nobody could stop. The storm rolled into the valley like something out of a disaster documentary. At first, it was only steady rain, tapping across rooftops and soaking the mountain roads. But within hours, the entire region transformed into a gray wall of water. Creeks swelled over their banks. Hillsides turned into mudslides waiting to happen. And upstream, Daniel stood inside the old reservoir control station, watching water levels rise inch by inch across gauges that had not seen pressure this severe in over 20 years. What makes this entire situation unbelievable is that the disaster still could have been minimized if the HOA board had acted responsibly even at the last minute. But pride is a dangerous thing, especially when wealthy people are terrified of lawsuits and collapsing property values. Instead of warning residents properly, the HOA leadership spent most of the evening trying to protect themselves. 7. That honestly blew my mind. But internal messages later revealed that several board members already knew state engineers had ordered preparations for a controlled floodgate release. They understood the overflow basin beneath Silver Ridge Estates was historically designed to absorb excess water during severe storms. They knew portions of the subdivision technically occupied protected runoff zones, but admitting that publicly would destroy the neighborhood overnight and expose years of negligence from both the developers and the HOA itself. So they stalled and they delayed emergency notices and they avoided using the word flood. And they kept telling residents the situation was under control while county officials quietly prepared evacuation routes behind the scenes. Meanwhile, Daniel's situation became increasingly impossible. Engineers monitoring the reservoir informed him that water pressure had crossed the first critical threshold shortly after midnight. If levels continued rising at the current rate, and the integrity of the upstream retaining walls could become compromised. And this wasn't optional recommendation anymore. State law required operators to maintain safe discharge levels regardless of downstream construction mistakes. That's the part people online kept refusing to understand. Later, Daniel did not choose revenge over safety. The HOA chose greed over safety years earlier when they built homes where overflow water was legally supposed to go. Huge difference. As rainfall intensified, emergency crews started moving through Silver Ridge door to door, advising voluntary evacuation for lower elevation homes. But confusion spread everywhere because HOA board members were simultaneously assuring residents there was no immediate danger. Some homeowners trusted county officials and packed valuables into their vehicles immediately. Others stayed put because they assumed the warnings were exaggerated liability precautions. 8. And that hesitation became devastating. Around 2 in the morning, the reservoir alarms activated upstream. Daniel later described the sound as haunting because he knew exactly what it meant. The final pressure margin was disappearing. Water surged through spillway channels faster than the drainage systems could stabilize naturally. Engineers performed rapid calculations and concluded that delaying release any longer risked uncontrolled overflow from the main containment structure itself. So after hours of legal consultations, emergency coordination calls, and state authorization confirmations, Daniel received the order he already knew was coming. Open the floodgates. Imagine standing there knowing one decision is about to destroy an entire luxury neighborhood while also knowing the neighborhood never should have existed in the first place. That psychological weight is insane. The release began gradually at first. Massive steel gates groaned open as decades of stored reservoir water thundered into the old downstream channels carved through the valley generations earlier. Under normal historical conditions, the overflow basin would have spread the water safely across undeveloped land before dispersing naturally into lower river systems, except now that the land was packed with expensive homes, paved roads, decorative stone walls, and underground utilities built directly across the floodplain. Within 30 minutes, lower sections of Silver Ridge Estates started flooding. Storm drains backed up almost instantly because the subdivision's redesigned runoff systems were never engineered for real overflow conditions. Water burst through landscape retention ponds, crossed sidewalks, and surged into streets residents believed were completely safe. Backyard fences collapsed one after another as muddy currents ripped through property lines, and suddenly the reality everyone ignored for years became impossible to deny. The valley was reclaiming itself exactly the way it had always been designed to do. By sunrise, Silver Ridge Estates looked unrecognizable. Luxury lawns had turned into muddy rivers, expensive stone entrances collapsed under rushing water, entire streets disappeared beneath swirling brown currents, carrying patio furniture, shattered fences, and pieces of decorative landscaping downstream. Emergency sirens echoed through the valley while rescue crews moved residents out by boat in some of the lower sections. And the craziest part, the homes hit hardest were the exact properties built deepest into Daniel's land. That detail became the centerpiece of the legal disaster that followed. As floodwaters spread through the subdivision, county investigators finally compared updated satellite scans with the original development permits. The findings were catastrophic for the HOA and developers. Drainage maps had been altered during construction approvals, environmental warnings were ignored, some floodplain reports were allegedly signed without proper review. Hearing all of that honestly felt unreal because this wasn't just incompetence anymore. This looked systematic. Meanwhile, Daniel stayed upstream, cooperating fully with state authorities. Every floodgate release had been documented legally. Every pressure reading was recorded. Every emergency authorization was time-stamped. The HOA tried blaming him publicly for weaponizing water, but that narrative collapsed almost immediately once engineers explained the reservoir would have risked structural failure if the gates remained closed. In other words, Daniel didn't flood the neighborhood. The HOA flooded itself years earlier, and the moment they approved construction inside a protected overflow basin, that realization destroyed Silver Ridge overnight. 10 residents who once mocked Daniel suddenly discovered their insurance companies refusing coverage after learning the homes sat on disputed land inside historical flood zones. Property values crashed instantly. Lawsuits exploded in every direction. Homeowners sued the HOA sued the developers blamed surveyors, surveyors blamed county records. And through all the chaos, one brutal fact remained impossible to escape. The man they treated like some powerless old landowner had quietly held every legal advantage from the very beginning. The aftermath dragged on for nearly 3 years, and according to people familiar with the case, Silver Ridge Estates never truly recovered. Entire rows of damaged homes were eventually condemned after structural engineers discovered long-term foundation instability caused by the flood saturation. Some properties were abandoned completely because repair costs exceeded market value almost overnight. Imagine paying millions for a dream retirement home only to discover it legally sat inside somebody else's flood basin the entire time. That's the kind of nightmare that destroys people financially. And honestly, the most shocking part was how fast everyone who supported the HOA leadership suddenly disappeared once lawsuits started flying. Board members resigned one after another, developers dissolved shell companies, contractors blamed missing paperwork, county officials claimed they relied on submitted surveys. It became one giant chain of people trying desperately to avoid responsibility. That's exactly how these situations play out in real life when greed finally catches consequences. Daniel, meanwhile, never celebrated publicly. He didn't do interviews. He didn't mock displaced homeowners. In fact, reports later showed he cooperated with state agencies to help redesign emergency drainage systems so nearby towns would remain protected during future storms. 11. That detail honestly says a lot about his character because most people would have become completely bitter after years of harassment. But legally, Daniel still won almost everything. Courts confirmed the disputed land belonged to him. Several homeowners eventually received partial compensation through massive settlement agreements funded by insurers and developer assets, but the HOA itself essentially collapsed under the financial pressure. Silver Ridge Estate stopped existing as an organization less than 18 months after the flood, and in the end, the valley returned to silence again. The gates remained upstream, the flood basin stayed protected, and the land that greedy people tried to take finally reminded everyone why boundaries exist for a reason. Bro, hearing this entire story genuinely felt unreal because it perfectly shows how arrogance can spiral into total disaster when people believe money protects them from consequences. The HOA thought they could bully one quiet landowner simply because he lived alone upstream and didn't have a massive legal team showing off in meetings every week. But the truth is, paperwork matters, land rights matter, environmental laws matter, and ignoring decades of flood history just to squeeze in more luxury homes is the kind of greed that eventually catches up with people in the worst possible way. What really stuck with me is that Daniel never screamed, threatened anyone, or tried acting like some revenge movie villain. He simply understood the law better than the people trying to take advantage of him. That's what makes this story so insane. The HOA destroyed itself through pure entitlement long before the floodgates ever opened. And honestly, stories like this happen more often than people realize. Well, tiny shortcuts turn into massive disasters once enough people start believing rules no longer apply to them